everyone. In this first podcast of the year, we will tackle the issue of accounting for variable consideration. In September 2022, EFRAG published a discussion paper entitled Accounting for Variable Consideration from a Purchaser's Perspective. The discussion paper is available on EFRAG's website in the publication section. To encourage you in reading our report and provide your views, we are going to introduce it to you through a podcast series. We start today with an introduction to the discussion paper, its subject, the link with EFRAG's activity, and the reasons behind its writing. It's delivered to us by Rasmus Sommer. So, Rasmus, could you present us the discussion paper and its background? Why EFRAG decided to work on this topic?
I would be very happy to do so, yes. So if we should take the first part of the question first, then EFRAG decided to work on the topic because constituents asked EFRAG to consider variable consideration when replying to EFRAG's research agenda consultation in 2018. And the main reason was that there is significant divergence in practice on how variable consideration is accounted for by the party who will have to pay the variable consideration. This also appears from both audit firms' accounting manuals and from past discussions of the IFRS Interpretations Committee. Now, when EFRAG started working on variable consideration, the ISB also had this topic in its research pipeline. But because of other important issues, it was removed from the pipeline. However, the issues related to variable consideration remain unsolved. The ISB may therefore consider the topic at a later stage or perhaps in combination with some of the projects it has added to its agenda.
So, thank you, Rasmus. You mentioned issues when it comes to accounting for variable consideration. Could you briefly describe them for us?
Yes. Firstly, however, we should probably clarify that in the discussion paper, we are generally talking about variable consideration outside business combinations. And for transactions that are not business combinations, two of the main issues in relation to variable consideration and on which divergence exists are, firstly, when a purchaser should recognize a liability in relation to variable consideration that depends on the purchaser's future actions. So, if I buy and receive a good from you, and the amount I would have to pay for this would depend on what I do in the future, should I recognize a liability for the variable consideration when, for example, I receive the good, or not until I perform the action that would trigger the variable consideration? The guidance that exists on this is interpreted differently. The discussion paper therefore considers and assesses different possible requirements without providing a preliminary preference for any of these. The second issue then relates to the asset I have purchased from you in return for variable consideration. If this asset is measured at cost, the question arises whether the cost should be updated to reflect changes in variable consideration. So, for example, should I measure the asset using the initial estimate of variable consideration I expect that I will have to pay, or should the measurement of the asset reflect what is eventually paid? Also here, there are different views on what to do, and the discussion paper therefore also here assesses different possible requirements without providing a preliminary preference for any of these.
Oh, so I understand the discussion paper addresses 6 questions, no less. Could you take us briefly through them?
Yes, the 6 questions in the discussion paper relate to the 2 main issues considered and then to the approach to standard setting that should be followed. So the first question is asking whether the respondents agree with the assessments made in the discussion paper on the different alternatives for when to recognize a liability for variable consideration that depends on the purchaser's future actions and when the respondents think such a liability should be recognized. It follows from the discussion paper that the notion of no practical ability to avoid could be important to consider when recognizing a liability for variable consideration that depends on the purchaser's future actions. And there is therefore also a question on when it could be said that you do not have a practical ability to avoid something. The next questions are then on whether the measurement at cost of the assets you purchase in return for variable consideration should be updated to reflect changes in the variable consideration. There is also a specific question on how respondents interpret the current definition of cost included in IFRS standards. Finally, there are a couple of questions on whether the issues related to variable consideration should be solved on a standards by standards level, or it should be thought to have some principles that would guide the requirements in the various standards that somehow deals or should deal with variable consideration, because variable consideration is relevant to many standards.
Thank you, Rasmus. The title of the discussion paper is Accounting for Variable Consideration from a Purchaser's Perspective. Which categories of financial reporting stakeholders should be interested in this question? Preparers, users, auditors?
Well, I think, in fact, all types of the stakeholders you mentioned should be interested in considering how requirements could be in this area. However, there are, in relation to the two main issues considered in the discussion paper, they probably occur more frequently in some industries than others, and are therefore more interesting for the stakeholders involved with those industries. We have, for example, received some input that the issues are very relevant for example, entities in the pharmaceutical industry and some sectors in the extractive industry. But these are just examples, as there are also quite some other industries for which the issues are relevant.
Well, this is now the end of our first episode. A great thank you to our guest, Rasmus Sommer, EFRAG Senior Technical Manager, for presenting us a short overview of the discussion paper. Thank you everyone for listening and following us during this first podcast. You can find the discussion paper and all related information on the EFRAG website in the open consultation and publication sections. I kindly remind you that the discussion paper is subject to consultation, so do not hesitate to submit your comments. Thank you for joining us.